Dr. Bayo Akomolafe is a celebrated speaker, post-humanist thinker, and intellectualist that has founded the Emergence Network as a planet-wide initiative to provide new ways to respond to the critical challenges we currently face as a species. And I've been delighted and confounded by so much of what Bayo puts out because it has a kind of poetic invitation that invites a different way of perceiving and experiencing the world. And so it is my pleasure to invite on Dr. Bayo Akomolafe. Welcome, brother.
Hey, brother. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for joining us here for this beginning of the journey.
My pleasure.
I wonder with this inquiry as well, if the future generations could speak to us, what would they be imploring us to understand? I'll just say a bit of a kind of funny inquiry. I went to ChatGTP just about a week ago because I was like, I wonder what, let's see what ChatGTP might say. And I said, is it possible that future generations could speak to us? And of course, it was polite and said, well, there's no scientific basis for that possibility. And yet it's been the subject of many metaphysical and, science fiction inquiries. And I said, okay, well, let's just pretend it's possible. What would it look like? And it actually said, okay, well, and it spat out some, pretty psychedelic imagery. And I was amazed, actually, just that it, would try. But I wonder for you, again, accessing perhaps a different kind of spiritual or ancestral metaphysical understanding. Yeah, what might swim to the surface with that question as we begin this navigation?
Well, thank you, brother. And thank you for starting out with ChatGPT. I've been having lots of conversations about AI. In fact, I've just finished a very, very quick essay about the Apple Vision Pro. You know that thing?
I've just seen the goggles and the
goggles. I've just finished an essay. I will, after this conversation, I'll just publish this. But maybe I'll start by saying this. Here's a proposition: that time isn't necessary. Time isn't necessary. And what I mean by that is to draw our attention to the ways that time is created. It is the secretion of bodies, and not just human bodies, post-human bodies. We often speak about time as if it's some idealized thing, universal. It's a fait accompli. It's already done, and all you can do is live inside of it, right? But there's a very, very soft and tender way in which we are temporalities ourselves, and that different kinds of nature cultures or natures summon different kinds of temporalities. Modernity is a kind of temporality, right? It fields and holds space for time, not just as duration, but as progress, right? So time is imbued with a sense of increasing sophistication and maybe a move away from simplicity, primitive simplicity, right? So modernity presumes and politicizes and thinks about time in certain ways, which is just a way to reiterate what I've said. Time isn't necessary. Time, that doesn't mean it's arbitrary, but time is a co-production. It's a co-production of multiple forces. Why do I say that? I say that because I feel that there are other temporalities possible, and that what we glibly call the future is possibly here with us already, right? And trained in the materiality of the contemporary. So the future is, I'm going to speak about it in a Baradian sense. The past is yet to come, and the future has already happened, right? The future is already stitched and embroidered in the world. It's the bodies and the howls and the lycanthropic voices and uh, the ghosts and the ancestry that are embedded in the architecture of the public. Uh, so for me, it makes beautiful sense to say that the future is speaking now. In fact, scientists call that the Anthropocene. You know,
Mm.
it's already here. We're seeing it here right now, what we are yet to be, right? Um, the future is here. I agree with that.
Mm. Mm. Thanks, Bayo. It reminds me of the quote. I think it was Lao Tzu, but it was, if you don't change direction, you'll end up where you're going. You probably heard that one.
Sounds like something from the uh, that the Cheshire Cat would have said as well.
Alice in
You know,
Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I so appreciate that the future is here in the sense that it is already stitched, it's already perhaps in motion. But I love what you said around the different temporalities. That
Yes.
yeah, I think it was different beings can carry different temporalities, and
Yes.
I'm struck by the. I was part of a Vision Wilderness Fast, series a few years ago, but it required sort of the basic architecture that many know is that
Yeah.
you have to sit somewhere for a while,
Yes. Yeah.
and don't leave, right? And
For a
just
while.
that, yeah, exactly. Just sit for a while, as my teacher said. Uh, and that what became sort of more true for that for me was a kind of slowing to at least even a whisper of what the pace might be of the wilderness that I was in, and the sense of a kind of like how to tree, what's the temporality of a tree in that, and like what's a relationship with that when I became to understand when the normal pace of a human typically is sort of a hummingbird on caffeine, or right, like
Mm-hmm.
compared to a tree's just way of being and the temporality and less
Mm-hmm.
experience. So
Mm-hmm.
I was just
Hmm.
struck by that, when you said this different temporality
Yeah.
of different beings and experiencing. And in some ways I feel like the human, at least in the Anthropocene, there's a deep irony, and I'll bring in AI one more time, just because,
Right.
not that I want to spend a lot of time on AI on this moment, but it's interesting that I was struck by. There's a lot of debate going on how, at least for generative AI, it robs the struggle of creativity. Right? That's what it was sort of said. It was like it kind of bypasses the effort to make something, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's faster, it's better, it's clearly the way to go. And it just strikes me that Marshall McLuhan famously said, of course, medium is the message, and also that technology, like there's always a trade-off, right? There's always a consequence. Cars, we get
Mm-hmm.
to drive anywhere as fast as we want, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
gridlock and miles of traffic, and the consequence of roads paving the skin of the earth. And I think
Right.
with AI, there's a similar sense of, oh, it's so easy, just go for it. But then there's now this sort of exponential production of content, right? And in some ways, a kind of it's saving time, but clearly it's speeding things up, actually, right? Because now we have to consume the content. And so it just strikes me that there's a kind of seduction of momentum, right,
Right.
that continually amplifies and in many ways takes us out of a kind of temporality that may
Yeah.
be required to attune, right,
Yes.
to what's to be done or what's needed. So I wonder what you
Yeah.
might think about that.
Yes, there is a sense in which there is an excessiveness, generative incapacitation, if you will, that is produced by these phenomena. I was just speaking about the immobility that is produced by so much choice a while ago,
Mm.
right? Like you're in a shopping mall and you have this variety, and so much to choose from that there's choice isn't possible any longer, and so you're stuck in the immobility of that. I think there is a sense in which modernity, hypersensitized by AI and its explorations, there's a sense in which modernity was the promissory note
Mm.
to more time, right?
Yeah.
We can have more time to ourselves, right? We can have more time for luxury, to contemplate the cosmos and all that, because of course we would be supported by these tin robots and
Mm.
and servants and doing that. What we did not anticipate was that time doesn't work that way. Time doesn't quite work that way. We're not in time. Our bodies secrete time,
Mm,
right? Time isn't necessary. It's a socio-material co-production. It's a coalitional effort. It's the algorithm of how bodies are entangled together. So in place of getting more time to ourselves, we are gentrified into a different kind of temporality. We are incarcerated in a space where it's more and more and more work, and more technologies are thrown into the mix, and we have less time for the
mm,
things that we say matter, right? So yeah,
mm.
we're
Well,
stuck
this,
somehow.
yeah, yeah. Well, this day, this focus is sacred grief and awe, right?
Yes.
And I feel like there is, I feel that current, so much in your writing, that on the one hand, there was a piece you wrote, "The Lines That Whisper Us," right? I believe it was
Hmm.
called, and
Lots
there's
of
so much,
flack for that one.
yeah. Well, I felt the realm of grief in that, which is like nobody can hold this, right? That was the phrase I think that was repeated a few times. It's like nobody can hold this. Speaking
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
outbreak of
yeah.
violence, and at the same time, like the way that you open up and use language in order to kind of um, obliterate this kind of certainty
Yeah.
of perception, right, or relationality, to me also feels like gateway to awe, because in that sense it kind of opens up, I mean, in some ways like a psychedelic, really, where there's a kind of opening into perceptual reality that, by and large, a kind of focused task completion, mundane perspective on the world, misses so much of the wonder. And those two
Mm.
things I feel are so apparent. But I wonder, yeah, how you might speak to that in terms of how those relate to each other, both the grief and the awe.
Mm. Um, I think in that same article, maybe not, maybe so, I refer to grief as a nomad of some kind,
Mm,
wandering the war machine. And this nomad is not welcome in settlement. Settlement is designed to proliferate certainty and confidence and possibly the pursuit of happiness,
mm,
um, but not grief. Not grief. We build ramparts to shield ourselves from grief. Grief is the vagabond. Grief is the thing to be rehabilitated, like death. You know. So I thought of grief as this post-humanist quality, like the like grief is the cartography of loss,
mm,
and the journeying and the pilgriming of loss, and that maybe our tendency, the dominant neurotypical tendency to guard against grief, is deepening our suffering.
mm,
Maybe because we don't really have spaces of grief. Um, we have spaces to fix, we have spaces to productivize, we have spaces for therapy. But grief is a sensuous solidarity of a different sort. It's like lamentation. There's something rich about the invitation to lament, to, and I think called it mutiny. That grief is mutiny against, it's a form of resistance. It's
mm,
against stereotypic, neurotypical rectilinear forms or postures. The posture of the citizen is upright. The posture of grief is seed-like. It's squeezed upon, onto itself. It's an unfoldment, and that's not
mm,
proper. And that's why I think there's some archetypal resistance of grief by the city, by settlement. My sense of things is that there is a vocation of radical hospitality that makes space for grief, that introduces us to awe,
mm,
right? That in meeting grief where it meets us, in touching grief where it touches us, we are afforded new glimpses of the world that was supposedly done with and fixed and complete. That grief cleanses as much as it muddies, right? It kind
Mm.
of uh, drags us out of the gentrification of expectations and allows us new visions, new senses of the world around us and in us. Yeah, and
Mm.
that's awesome.
Mm.
That was cheesy.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm struck by, so there's a comment in here actually from Lorraine, but she says, how does the flow of water speak to the flow of time? And there's an element I want to bring in terms of water and grief, because I feel like, often we say, the flowing of tears, right? There's practices that I've come across where when there's time to grieve, it's time to like go to the ocean, right? It's time to go to
Right.
bodies of water. It's time to drench oneself in water. That there's clearly a relationship as well between water and grief. And the last thread I'll
Mm,
make in terms of time, grief, is in eros actually as well. That there is this relationship to flow, and I could extrapolate quite a bit on Tamara's approach. The community, of course, that featured in the Village of Lovers, where they have a very sophisticated understanding of this relationship between eros and water, and that eros itself likes to flow. It doesn't want to be stagnant, right? It wants to nourish in its very way. And yet, when it's trapped, when it's contained, then it doesn't have the opportunity to be itself in a way and to bring its medicine. And so, yeah, I'd love to play with that a bit. This relationship between these things: time, grief, and eros.
mm. Well, I have, I often think about trauma as time travel, right?
Mm,
Um, Trauma is, no, without settling for some categorical definition of trauma, as if it's a thing, already done and dusted, and we know what it is. Um, there's a sense in which trauma resists um, the flow of time as a thing that marches imperially forward,
mm,
right? It's like it like reminds us that we're still somewhere else, that our bodies are not just local, they're diasporic, they're virtual. So in the way that 1945, brother, August 6th and 9th, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how
mm,
they are, how the explosion recently dramatized. July 16th, 1945 is the Trinity tests in Oppenheimer.
mm,
But a few months later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that explosion um, irradiated the world,
mm,
sent radioactive elements into water and skin and flesh and bodies. And years later, decades later, children are still being born with radioactive elements from 1945.
mm,
1945 is still throbbing and
mm,
simmering beneath the surface of 2024. In a sense, we are constantly navigating, not necessarily in a conscious way, but we're constantly straddling time and experimenting like virtual particles with um, different temporalities. And we're doing that all the time in very corporeal, material, and practical ways, right? If you see the laminal flow of water, sometimes it could become so stabilized that it looks like a frozen piece, like
mm,
the flow. It looks frozen. Only if you disrupt it do you find that it's actually moving,
mm,
and it's moving beautifully. Um, Grief feels like a disruption of time's flow.
mm,
Um, it feels like a curdling of milk, it like a crack.
mm,
And I don't want to universalize it. I'm speaking about it within the vortices of our moral engagements with suffering, with the Middle East, with questions of justice, with notions of the human, with the identity of the settler and the settled and the appropriated and the mispronounced, and notions of human agency. All of that is present here. When I speak about grief as the trouble that interrupts, I do not speak from an Archimedean transcendent space where everything can be universally glimpsed. I'm speaking about it in very fragile, vulnerable ways, intimacies and animacies within. That grief feels like an interjection, like a rejection of continuity, like an invitation to fall to the earth, like some kind of time travel, like a way of our bodies insist on being elsewhere, engaging in other kinds of vocations other than what is or has been deemed productive by civilization. So grief, time travel, flow, yeah, there's something there.
Thank you. I'm really struck by that. Trauma is time travel. That really stood out for me as well. And the sense that there's like grief as it's like a porousness in a way, right?
Yeah.
That kind of disrupts and seeps out of normalcy. Normalcy as the flow of get to it, tasks to be done. That kind of maniacal momentum.
Yes.
And also again, I'm struck by the grief as the gateway to awe, in that there's a sense of through the maybe melting away of those certainties, or the burning down of the way that you thought things should be or always be, and all of a sudden now there's a kind of there's a disassembling, right, of that level of certainty in the way it is, and it kind of it tenderizes so much of the time, right, in a way, and again, but I see that as a kind of necessary tenderizing in the face of the kind of calamity and what's unfolding now. I mean, over so much around the world, right? That there's some kind of necessity. It feels like, to be willing to be in the process, right, of grieving, rather than kind of clenching on and maintaining a level of I don't know, calcified white knuckle grip on keeping things the same, right? So this sense of awe as the on the other side, right, of that kind of surrender, right, seems true, and it seems paradoxical, but also kind of beautifully stitched together in the way that they seem, Kent.
You know the story I tell all the time, brother, about the trickster god, the Yoruba god who travels with the slaves. You know that story, right? I tell it all the time.
I don't think I've heard that one. Yeah, no, please do.
The transatlantic slave trade. Ships come to Africa, and the Orishas, led by the god Ogun, who is the god of metal and victory, mount up an insurgency, a resistance, a force to chase away the slavers. And this is a story that is told and was told by a Nigerian playwright called Femi Yuba. And so as the Orishas rush to the beach, they're intercepted by Eshu. Eshu is trickster. Eshu is the archetype. The Eshu is the ecotone of reality, right? It's the place where things become threadbare, right? And Eshu is a constant tugging on fields of certainty, the wilds beyond fences. So Eshu intercepts, drugs his brother god, the Orisha called Ogun, and gives him some very intoxicating alcoholic palm wine, we call it back in Nigeria, and then proceeds to travel with the slaves. He doesn't close the breach. He doesn't close the wound. He doesn't heal the opening. He travels into the cracks. He accompanies grief, and it was grief inducing. He doesn't offer joy, he doesn't offer hope. He just travels with those incarcerated bodies. And somehow that act of radical accompaniment is the condition for creolized futures, right?
Mm.
You spoke about eros, and I think about eros as ethics. Morality is the um, coalitional potential, the regulatory potential of bodies in coalition. Let's put it
Mm.
that way. The codificatory potential of bodies in coalition is that when we meet with others, their expectations become us, our expectations become them, rules and legislation and rituals and rights and borders and porosities emerge. And morality is this dynamic force of creativity and destruction, right? And it can collect in a way that holds like a force. It can collect and it can become so exhausted in its tensility, right, that it no longer produces anything except itself. It's at that moment that ethics, which is the flow of things, you see, um, uh, morality is a configuration of ethical flow, right? Ethics
Mm.
is how the world is constantly experimenting with itself in its ongoing way. It has no identity, it has no definition, it is not good or bad. Concepts of good or bad are only articulable within fields of morality. But sometimes those questions turn on themselves and they no longer know where else to go. It's at that moment the monsters, the
Mm.
monsters shape-shifting intervention cracks open the chalice, the borders, and morality bleeds. And the bleeding of morality is ethics. Then something else wants to be born. That's where the trickster is invited. And that's why I think Issue did not heal the breach, because maybe healing the breach would have sealed into space the contradictions and the terrible things and the violence of the room. He needed to break out of the room. Grief is like a breaking away, it's like a cracking open of the containment of subjectivity. And it allows a traveling with, if we stayed with the trouble of it.
Mm. Thank you for that. Yeah, I wrote down a few things, but Eros is ethics and radical accompaniment. That strikes me as I mean, very powerful in the sense that we are in a time when there is so much like the forces that have been unfolding. You brought up Oppenheimer, right, and the nuclear explosion that is still pulsing, still reverberating.
Right.
That in the sense that there's there's the part in me, let's say, or the part in kind of helpful, heroics that wants to heal these things, right? How do we fix them?
Right. Right.
Right?
Right.
How do we seal in the, okay, we dealt with that, or because there is an innate desire, I think, to help. That this is
Yes.
something that shows itself, so many times. There's I read some report one time around. It was essentially the impact of trauma or PTSD from committing violence,
Mm-hmm.
right? That like soldiers were experiencing from committing violence, and then their own experience of PTSD from that. And it struck me, in the article made some comment like, you don't get PTSD from helping people, right? Like, as in there's clearly a kind of organismic kind of directionality, right? Of oh, this tends to be helpful, makes you feel good, and like this one, here's consequence. And I
Mm-hmm.
hear in you saying the ethics of that isn't good or bad, but there's consequence. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in this sense, right, the invitation to radically accompany so many in this time, when again forces unleashed are the monstrosities are deeply apparent,
Mm-hmm.
is powerful. I mean, it is a
Mm-hmm.
powerful way of not fixing. I hear maybe what you're saying, right? But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, inviting in just a kind of being with, and in that sense, there's a faith there or a trust that matters, I suppose.
Something like that, brother. Maybe I would first respond by saying I'm very shy, reluctant to accept stories about innate goodness.
Mm.
I'm very they, they quickly lead, in my own analysis, to dead ends, right? Because innate, ascriptions of innate goodness often lead to ascriptions of essential evilness.
Mm.
And when we start to think in terms of those stabilized categories, then our thinking becomes stuck on itself. I like to think in the lower case. I don't think in capital letters. I want to think in a quick and nimble and yet slow and intimate and tender way.
Mm.
So that I'm very, again, reluctant to think about hardwired biological determinism, right? That is separate from um, socio-material effects and cultural positioning. Um, Maybe it's the case that we don't feel PTSD for helping people. Of course, what helping people is already, we should draw many lines under that and
Mm.
put scare quotes around that, because
Mm.
what do you mean by helping people? There are many moral scenarios I could cook up right now that would trouble that, but but take several steps back and say, you know, maybe it's the case that we don't feel that because we are embedded within, you know, structures. I'm trying to mark some kind of contingency here, instead of saying that that's the nature of what we are, that's the way we are, right? um
Mm.
so I'm maybe we don't feel that because we are habituated that way. Maybe our bodies have taken long to act that way, which is not the same thing as saying that there is a genetic predisposition, because there's epigenetics, but to say that we are dependent and ongoing frameworks, right? There isn't an essential thing at work here, a stabilized finality here or fixity, you know, to the question, what is human nature,
Mm.
right? Because it's only when we think processually and relationally, only then do we start to notice the gift of grief,
Mm.
right? Or the gift of these things that might be called pathological to modernity. You see, that's the danger of binarizing the world in that way, of stabilizing it as, oh, your brain is hardwired to be good. Mm, the sentiment
Mm.
reeks of coloniality to me. I don't know.
Mm.
But I was going to say something else, but I've traipsed off the plot.
Well, yeah, thank you for illuminating that further. And maybe I might add as well a sense of maybe the brain is hardwired, it seems to be, for relationality. Perhaps that's maybe I might say it a bit different. But I guess what I'm also trying to say is one of the things that is very clear in the film, that I mean, clear in a sense, but not overtly said, is
Right.
that the difference between being in a society that is sort of moves along a relational matrix. Rian Eisler, right, in the book Chalice and the Blade, she differentiates between partnership cultures and domination cultures as a way of just like, how does the matrix of force move right within the society. And that to me is more so, I suppose what I mean is, and I would even call this a village way, maybe as a broad stroke, but that there seems to be a kind of, right, a kind of art of relationality that doesn't I was reading Sabanfu Some's book, of course, The Spirit of Intimacy as well. And she says that there's something in the sense that it's very dangerous if ever the villagers use power over, right, within the village, because they know it's like, oh, that it kind of unleashes a kind of matrix of relationality that maybe you could say it's a domination one or a force. And then there's consequence to that, right, versus a partnership matrix of relationality. And that's the thing that I was struck by when I went to Tamara, is that there's such a artfulness and a skillfulness. And so that maybe that's kind of what I was trying to illuminate as well, that
Yeah, yeah.
we're sort of asked into a different relationality in order to even
Yes.
accompany, right, to even see like you said, I
Yes.
think in one of your recent posts, the shoemaker and the elves, and this kind of sense
It's
of relying upon this sort of invisible quote invisible
yeah,
slavery and all these structures of oppression and extraction that go on, simply to be here on this computer, right? That modernity sort of suppresses all of that and just focuses on the shiny object and
that
says,
makes
"Isn't this
sense.
great?" So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, there's
yeah.
some sense that I'd be curious to, and knowing that we're close to the end of this beautiful conversation, but yeah, I wonder how to invite folks into that kind of um, being able to perceive relationally, as we go even deeper into these times of
Right.
uncertainty.
Yes, brother. I would think or situate or think about that and situate that as a kind of intelligence, and I think it's the intelligence that comes with loss. You
Mm,
know, it- um, I think about loss together with blackness. I'm not speaking about the what I call big B blackness or the capital blackness, which is after is a very humanist kind of blackness. It's caught up in conversations about identity and representation and inclusion and diversity, um, and it wants a piece of the pie, you know. But there's a different kind of blackness I theorize. It's para-ontological. I borrow the term from Neon Chandler and Fred Moulton and Saidiya Hartman and these black scholars. This blackness is like entropy. It's like it's like this ethical force that I speak about that is constantly teasing new intelligences. It's constantly teasing the edges of the already formulated. Right? It is the indebtedness of form to its decay. It is right. It's every form is indebted to its eventual demise, and
mm,
this demising of things, which feels like the which feels like what grief is a herald of. This demising of things is what I think of as blackness, and I think we are in such a time when white stability is losing its buoyancy. And by white stability, of course, you know this, brother. We've had several conversations where I've had to
mm,
state very carefully that whiteness is not reducible to white people. You know, I don't see it that way. I don't see whiteness as centrally committed to matters of identity. Whiteness is the racialized arrangement of bodies to serve instrumental economic purposes and
mm,
philosophical, cosmological, theological purposes, right? It's the arrangement of bodies. Whiteness is an arrangement, right? Um, and whiteness can often take, and this is a side musing, a side contemplation, but whiteness can often be recontextualized as diversity. That
mm,
even diversity could be a configuration of whiteness, right? So diversity is increasingly losing its scandalous nature, right?
mm,
And you could have a racially diverse group that is instrumental to white continuity, instrumental to the forms of captivity and capitalist capture that that marks our time. Um, the blackness I speak about is indeterminacy. That's what's scandalous to modernity, to white modernity, not diversity. As much as we need that, right?
mm,
This is not to dismiss that either, but blackness is the scandalizing of form. It's the indeterminacy of form, um, and I think that indeterminacy is creeping in. We are losing our um, we're losing the handles by which we have navigated the world confidently. And that's the occasion for grief. But that's how the intelligence of relationality comes in. The idea that we have never been disconnected. Even in our performances of separation, that was a form of entanglement. We've
mm,
never been isolated, separate, alone. We've always been surrounded, infused, informed by the world around us. And that, I think, is the sermon of grief.
mm. The sermon of grief. You said, yeah, the performance of separation as well.
Yeah,
Wow.
like entanglement is what separation is, what entanglement is doing too. It's not separation versus entanglement. Is that separation or separability is just another iteration of entanglement.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Wow. I mean, there's so many threads you so beautifully articulated here. And, in our last few minutes here on this conversation, I wonder, we're also, of course, beginning this 5-day journey here through all of this elemental procession and in this
Right.
inquiry. And so I guess my final question to you as well is, how do you, how do you apply or proceed, these understandings in navigating this kind of, this collapsing of temporality, this relational, releasing the performances of separation. This is my curiosity, for folks as well who are just rife, certainly with the dissolution, And this is, of course, not to say, well, what do we do about it? But it's there's something in there, of some kind of orientation of proceeding would be beautiful to hear.
As an African, I don't really dig the I don't know why I had to start that way, but I'll just proceed because I've already
Mhm.
launched it. I don't really dig the idea of saying spoiler alert, right? I
Mm.
don't see why. I don't understand why it's such a huge thing in this stylized global north to say spoiler alert, before you talk about a movie. But this is one of the rare times that I want to say that phrase, spoiler alert, um, in the context of your question about what comes next or what to do or how to stay with this loss. I don't know. And the I don't know is more generative than an apophatic, than um, an inadequacy of some kind. Um, Maybe the thing to notice here is we've been embedded for so long within a nation state order. We've been embedded within modern civilizing moralities. It's hard for us to speak about what comes next. In fact, it's not always desirable to think about how we address um, the loss of stability. But there's something about the invocation, the vocation of staying with the trouble of our being carried away. Notice I use the words carried away. I'm suggesting that the loss of white stability, this infusion of grief as an animist ethic, um, is coterminous with our being spirited away. We're being carried away, and there's nothing more mortifying to the citizen subject uh, than being carried away, like those bodies at the door of no return in Ghana,
Mm.
right? We're being carried away. It happened to them. Now those ships are at the shores of the modern, and we are also being carried away. We're losing our names, we're losing our identities, the confidence of a vacation next week. There's now all these modding and modeling effects, pandemics and viruses, and our political affiliations no longer seem to behave like what we signed up for. So it seems like this loss, this hollowing out of confidence, this infusion of grief, this nomadicity of loss is being carried away. But there is a practice, there is a village of technologies, there is an ecology of practices that might emerge with being carried away. Maybe it looks like tracing. Maybe it looks like radical accompaniment. Maybe it looks like speculative fabulation. Maybe it looks like inventing stories at the edges. Maybe it looks like sitting with failure. Maybe it looks like hugging a tree, right? There's something just sensuous and spillage like, slippage like, that is the vocation to get lost together. I call these discourses chiasmography, and that means the ethnography within cracks. And what that looks like and how that is performed is a vocation for a 2-hour conversation between us, brother.
Well,
spoiler alert is all I'm saying.
Spoiler alert. We don't know. Thank you so much, Bayo, for coming and being with us here to open up our time together, 5 days, Cry from the Future. And anybody that doesn't know your work yet, I implore you, please check out bayoakomolafe.net, I believe, if that's true. It's .com.
Yes, it's bayoakomolafe.net. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, wonderful. Check out your writings. You have courses as well that are a real contribution. So once again, thank you for saying yes. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Bayo.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother.
And
take care.
Onward we go.
Awkward we go. Awkward we go.
I like that. Okay.
Take care, brother. Bye.